It's good to be here with everybody out here. So I'll be talking about sandboxes. So sandboxing has been there for quite some time. So how many people use sandboxes? Okay. How many people use browsers? So every browser has a sandbox, right? So sandboxing has become an integral part of what we do today in our security lives, and even the iOS, even the apps you get have a layer of sandboxing. So in this talk, I'll be talking about sandboxing on Windows operating system. But before I start, a little bit about myself. I'm in a startup called Bromium. We launched this company around 3 years back. I guess it's not longer a startup anymore. It's 3 years old. But before that, I have done a bunch of startups, mainly in the security world. My first startup was an IDS way back in 2000. And then I like to focus on offensive, defensive kind of security research. And this talk actually I presented at Blue Hat earlier last year, and also at Black Hat in Amsterdam. So this is a variation of that talk, and I would say an increment of my previous talks. So the agenda is I'll talk about sandboxes from an architectural perspective, and more from a security architect or a pen tester's perspective, right? And then we'll kind of categorize the various types of sandboxes we encounter on a daily basis. And then I'll kind of do some live exploit demos where we break out of every sandbox. And after we understand the architectural limitations of these sandboxes, right? So the last part has some more fun stuff. The first part is the gory details, yeah. So, but I have to go through those. So what's a sandbox? I think if you have kittens and cats, you might actually relate to this. This is also a sandbox, a real-world sandbox. But the sandbox, the whole concept of a sandbox is to create an environment where you can isolate a threat or you can run untrusted content, right? That's kind of the main goal of a sandbox. The idea is that you should be able to contain code so that it doesn't infect the user, right? So that so you assume that whatever is coming inside the sandbox is an exploit or malware. So you have to assume that, right? It's untrusted. And for this talk, I'm going to be talking only about application sandboxes. And for this talk, I've kind of divided it into two categories, type A and a type B. And it's kind of my own naming convention. Type A, type B kind of sounds easy to remember. But the idea is there are two different types of sandboxes broadly which you see in the market. So type A is Sandboxy. How many of you have used Sandboxy? It's been there for almost 10 years now, right? Buffer Zone is another product which is kind of not so popular, but it's been there. And a recently launched product called Dell DDP, Dell product. No, so that's kind of the HTML5 and all of those have those sandboxes. So I won't be talking about those, but I'm talking about the architecture of the implementation of a sandbox here. Yeah, it's very similar to type B, I would say. It's very similar to type B, but the implementation details are a little bit different. And I will be actually talking about them later this year. We're doing some research in that area, specifically for Windows 8 platforms, right? There's a lot of new stuff which is coming out there. So in type B is probably the most popular. Chrome, I guess you use the Chrome browser, right? And Adobe Reader X, both of which are actually derived from the Chromium project. It's an open source project which Google bought several years back, and they are actually what I call a type B sandbox. So what we'll do is I'll talk about these a little bit in details from an architectural perspective, and once we understand the limitations of the architecture, we'll do the exploitation fun stuff. So little bit digression here. So before we get into details, just a quick view of how operating system internals work. This is kind of how the operating system Windows works, right? So you have two components broadly classified. One is the user mode, and then you have the kernel mode, right? And we don't realize, but we rely heavily on the kernel for a lot of the day-to-day interaction that we do, a lot of the work we do. Like for example, just opening a font file you actually are directly making calls to the kernel, right? And it has been done mainly for performance, but it's kind of bad for security, right? And so actually we talked about this to Microsoft, and actually they are looking at evaluating how they can reduce this attack surface, which we'll exploit later now in this talk. So the idea is that the kernel is a huge attack surface. It's a huge, humongous amount of code, probably 20 millions of lines of code at least, or probably a little bit more. So which means that there will always be bugs and there will always be vulnerabilities which can be exploited by, say, by attackers, right? So that's kind of how operating system works. Now let's look at a type A sandbox. So that's the first category. This is what I said as sandboxy. So the idea is, so how a type A sandbox works is it's basically a kernel driver, and the idea is to run untrusted code inside an encapsulated container. It's a virtualized file system, virtualized container, which is done at an application layer, pretty much, right? And you have drivers which interact with the kernel and allow or disallow access. So if you break it from an architecture perspective, this is how kind of these sandboxes look. What you have is a kernel driver, right? And then you have a sandbox process inside the sandbox. So the kernel driver basically makes a decision whether an API call can be made. Is it allowed or not allowed, right? Let me give you a quick demo of how it looks in real world. I should buy a license for a sandbox, I guess. So what I have done here is I've opened a command prompt inside a sandbox, and then I open Notepad outside the sandbox. So I should not be able to kill the Notepad process from the sandbox because it should not have access outside the sandbox, right? So I do a task kill. It says access denied, right? Which means that I don't have the privilege to kill anything outside the sandbox. And I'll talk about how we deal with that, how we break out of that, and how we can access that once I go in the exploitation phase. But that's kind of how type A sandbox looks like, right? Any questions? Right? It's a pretty straightforward model, I would say, from a design perspective. I would say this is the simplest type of sandbox available. Next is type B, which is Google Chrome. This is probably the most sophisticated and the most advanced sandbox which you find in real world, right? So, and for how we are defining it is that you have a master and a slave, and how it works is the slave is confined to what it can access, and everything is channelized through the master, right? Which means that master is like the traffic policeman. It's like it has policies and it decides what access is allowed and what is disallowed to the slave, right? And the master has the smallest attack surface. It's the smallest amount of code base by design. The idea is that to break out of the slave, you should be able to break out of the master, which is going to be incredibly hard. That's why you see very few exploits for Chrome, just because of this simple granular model, how they have defined and architected this, right? And these are probably the most popular applications. I guess everybody uses Chrome here. You should be using IE. I'm just kidding. Anyways. So the master has a very small code base. So the idea is that it will be very difficult to break and exploit it. And the slave is the renderer, which has all the rich goody stuff, the HTML5, all the rendering objects, everything is inside the slave, right? So it will be far more easier to find a vulnerability in the slave. So if you look at the Chrome patches, the bugs they fix, there are probably hundreds of patches for the renderer, right? So there are lots of vulnerabilities which are there, but they cannot be exploited because to exploit that, you have to break out of the master. And that's the kind of the secret sauce why it has been so successful in the world today, right? But the problem here is that the slave has to still directly interact with the kernel, right? So if my kernel got compromised, or if I have a kernel vulnerability, I could possibly break out of the master and completely bypass the master. And this is an architectural limitation, right? And also the slave, which we actually found later in our research, also has access to some user mode components, which is one more attack surface, which we will exploit in a bit. A little bit on how it works, because this is kind of very interesting how they have designed Google team. So this is kind of the master. You have it's kind of control. All the communication happens via IPC mechanism, right? And this is the sandbox, and the master decides via the policy what accesses are allowed, what are disallowed, right? So for example, the slave runs with low privileges, for instance, restricted tokens, job object, desktop object, integrity levels. These are the OS controls available to minimize the access to the slave. And interestingly, as per the Chromium open source project, it's not as hardened as you would imagine. For instance, mounted FAT and FAT32 volumes, there is no protection today as per the open source Chromium project. And for TCP/IP, there is no protection. And then access to most other stuff is pretty much, I would say, confined and available, which is probably good enough from a security standpoint, from an architectural standpoint, right? So this is how it works. So if you make like a file access call today in the Chrome browser, this is what happens behind the scenes. So this is 2856 PID is the slave, and this is the master. So here you are trying to access this DLL. The slave needs to access this netscanner DLL, and it's the moment it accesses it, it gets an access denied, right? And then it has to request to the master that, hey, master, I need to access this DLL. Can you please request me? Can you please give me access? And the master basically decides that, okay, this is allowed, and it duplicates the file handle, and ultimately it gives access to the slave. So all of this happens via named pipes mechanism. So so this is actually a procmon view. So procmon doesn't look at name pipes, but this is what happens behind the scene for every action you do in Chrome browser. This is how it works, the inner workings of a Chrome browser, right? So so the question is now, how resistant is master to a malicious slave, right? And this is what most people have been working on. The idea is that, and that's kind of behind the whole concept behind the design of the Chrome sandbox, right? We expect that the slave is going to be malicious, so master has to be resilient to those attacks from the slave, right? And most of the past research has been in that direction, but it has been changing towards the other side, which is how resistant is the operating system to a malicious slave? Now that we know that the slave has direct access to certain OS components, what if there was an OS vulnerability which I could leverage from the slave, right? And this is kind of what we focus on. In fact, the Pawn-to-Earn contest, have you heard about that Pawn-to-Earn contest? So last year, around the time when we published our first paper, the MWR labs also bypassed Chrome using a kernel vulnerability. And they got a good bounty prize, which is kind of cool, right? Google is apparently giving lots of cash this year as well, from what I hear, but it's for the Chrome OS. Nobody uses Chrome OS. Anyways. So master-slave sandbox on a Windows Adobe Reader, this is how it looks like. So if you open the properties of your Adobe Reader, you will see that the low integrity level, it limits the network connectivity, it limits a lot of accesses which are like controls from the operating system. So this is how the Adobe sandbox has been implemented. And you know what, Adobe and Chrome are part of the same project, which is the Chromium project, but the implementation is very different from security standpoint. The hardening and the work involved has been very different. And then, so for Adobe Reader, there's a lot of work. In fact, one of the first malware was identified in the wild in February last year, which broke the Adobe Reader sandbox. And this was, I think, I guess, a year after Adobe said that they had zero malware. So kind of not a good claim to make, I guess. So, but that malware was a complex malware. Why was it complex? It was because the vulnerability which was exploited was in the master. So you have to have multiple vulnerabilities to pivot out of the sandbox, right? So I think that there are easier ways to break out of the Adobe Reader instead of going that approach, and that's what we'll be talking about now. Okay. So this is the Chrome browser. Chrome browser is far more robust in terms of security. They have invested a lot of money, a lot of effort. They have some very smart guys in Google who are hardening the browser all the time. So if you see right here, you see something called untrusted integrity level. This is far more restrictive than the one that Adobe Reader has, right? So just the simple hardening point of view, Adobe Reader hasn't been as hardened as Chrome, although they use the same architecture, right? Which is kind of interesting, which means that, PDF bugs, now you know why PDF bugs are so common. Anyways, for Chrome, it is far more deprivileged than what's publicly available. Like as per the Chromium project, you can access FAT32 system, file mounting, and so on. But for the Chrome browser, first of all, you have the untrusted integrity level, and then the access to FAT32 file system is completely denied, which means that even if you compromised, you will have to do a lot more work to bypass all these restrictions and compromise the user and infect the machine, right? Okay, so most of the attacks in the Chrome browser, again, have been targeted at the master. Have you heard of Pinkie Pie, the expert by Pinkie Pie? So I think it was a couple of years back, one guy wrote an incredible exploit to break out of the Chrome browser. I think he won the bounty prize. I think it was like 5 or 6 vulnerabilities hopping around, and it was a masterful exploit to write, right? But those exploits are very difficult. I would say they are far rare, and I would say from a malware point of view, very few people would really write those kind of exploits unless it's like a nation state targeted attack. Most of the malware guys are, I would say, lazy guys, as most of us, and they want the easy way out. So and that's what, I think those kind of exploits will kind of are not real world in terms of from a malwareable point of view, which kind of proves the point of the sandbox, right? So now, have you heard of the BPF syscall filter? So this is a project on the Linux operating system, and actually Chrome uses that. So as you saw in the previous my previous slides, Chrome is vulnerable to the kernel attacks because of the exposure to kernel layer. However, this BPF syscall filter limits the syscalls, and it kind of reduces the attack surface dramatically on the Linux operating system. So this is a far more robust architecture. And however, still, Chrome has gone further ahead, and even if you exploited the slave, you still have to do a lot of work. For instance, if you need to create a process, if you need to alter specific registry locations, you cannot do all of that. It's completely blocked in Chrome. These are like special extra effort added in the browser. However, win32k.sys is completely open. It's like out there in the beach, having fun, So it's completely exposed, So this is kind of a huge attack surface. And last year, I don't know if you've noticed, there were like close to 80 patches on the Windows kernel. Probably 80% of them were on win32k.sys, and they were from Google guys, So it's obvious that they know about this attack surface, and they are trying to harden it as much as they can. Okay, so that was the architectural stuff, and now I'll get into the exploitation stuff, which is kind of the fun bits, right? So one couple of slides on how kernel exploits work, right? So if you are inside a sandbox, how would a kernel exploit work, right? So how it works today is, if you are an application inside a sandbox, you say that, dear kernel, please open a file for me, and the file is at location at address X, for instance, right? And the kernel points to allowed file.txt. It's an allowed, as you saw the API control in the sandbox, right? And it says, here is the file handle for you, right? And then the sandbox application says, dear kernel, please open a file for me. And the file name is at address Y. But the kernel says, you know what? This points to a location called secret file. And you are a sandbox application, and I cannot let you access that file. So as I just showed in my demo, when I did the sandbox demo, I could not kill notepad.exe. That's exactly how it works. The enforcement happens like that. Right? This is how it's implemented in the kernel. However, supposing you had a malicious user or a malicious exploit coming out there, how it would work. So the sandbox application will say, dear kernel, please draw the text hello world for me using the TrueType font. The TrueType font is, by the way, the most beautiful font I've seen. All the cool exploits. Have you heard of DoQ? It uses the TrueType font. It's kind of fun stuff. Anyways, so it's stored at address X. Now the kernel will say, okay, you know what? You're a sandbox application, but using a font is a natural. It's kind of a good natural thing to do, right? You have to use a font. I cannot block that. So you need to access it to function properly. So you know what? Before I give you access to that, I need to parse the font, right? And then while passing the font, the kernel corrupts its own memory because there was a bug there, there's a vulnerability there in the font. And after that memory corruption, the kernel starts executing code at X, where it can do anything it wants. Right? Basically, you have complete control over the machine out there from there on. Okay, so now I start the exploit. So this is kind of my kernel. So this is the list of kernel exploits which have been there for the past 18 months. So we select one exploit called the systhread exploit. It was found by actually my coworker at Bromium Labs. And so this is kind of the kernel hacker there, out there, right inside. So what I'll do is now I'll do a breakout out of the sandbox using a kernel exploit. Okay. So here what I do is I run the exploit. I need the PID of the process which I'm going to exploit. I'll explain that in a bit. So what I do now is I run a kernel exploit. And after I exploit the kernel, I have the same privilege as that of the driver of the sandbox, right? You remember the architecture of the sandbox? And then what I do is I pivot out of the sandbox by migrating to a process called WinInit, which is of PID 384, right? So just check out the exploit now. No blue screen, that means it's a good sign. So as you can see, I ran a kernel exploit, and after that I migrated to the host. Now I have complete control over the machine. If you see, if I did a who am I, I'm kernel, I'm system right now. The sandbox has been completely breached, right? To demonstrate that, I'll just kill the notepad, which I was not able to kill earlier, right? Game over, right? So this was a complete breakout of the sandbox. And the problem here is, the problem here is that this is an architectural limitation. You cannot do anything about it. This is a design limitation. You cannot solve this problem, because this is, if your kernel is vulnerable, what can you do about it, right? So is this a problem? Is this like a serious problem? Is this like a joke? Well, in the year 2012, there were around 25 CVEs, 25 kernel patches from Microsoft. Last year, there were 80 plus CVEs on the kernel, right? Which means that it's a huge attack surface. More vulnerabilities are occurring more frequently. And recently, we found a variant of the TDL4 rootkit, which was exploiting a kernel vulnerability which can pretty much bypass any of these sandboxes in the wild, right? And the worst part is, you have been warned. I mean, it didn't come on. I should have used a black font, I guess. Anyways, it's a large attack surface. You cannot do much about this. Application sandboxes are fundamentally vulnerable to this. You cannot solve this problem. This is a design architectural limitation, right? Any questions on this so far? Yes. So my last exploit does that, answers your question. I'll come to there. I'll answer that question in 10 minutes. Okay? Anything else for the kernel exploit so far? No. Okay, good. Great. So when we did this, people came and said, okay, you know what? Kernel exploits are tough, and how many people can write a kernel exploit? And so we said, okay, fine. Let's look at what else is possible in that world, right? So what we did is actually we sat down and looked at the various sandboxes and what is the attack surface exposed to the operating system, right? What else is possible which is non-kernel based but in the user mode, because apparently some people think that user mode exploits are easier to write, which probably might be true in some cases, right? So then what we found was type A and type B sandboxes do not restrict network connectivity for a sandbox process, right? And Google Chrome again is an exception. They have hardened this so that even if the renderer got exploited, it's still very difficult to come out of it. It will still be confined in that context, right? However, if you do an RPC dump on local host on a sandbox process, you will see that at least 18 plus named interfaces which are available and exposed right now, right? Which means that a vulnerability in any of these services can be abused to break out of the sandbox. Yet again, and these are user mode components, right? So what we found was ALPC ports. Have you heard of ALPC port? These are the advanced local procedure calls. This is a low-level mechanism used for inter-process communication on the Windows operating system. And there are many services which listen at ALPC ports. And if a sandbox can connect to these services, it can basically attempt to exploit a vulnerability in it, right? And the type A sandboxes are completely open and exposed to this attack surface, right? So what we did is we did a comparison of Adobe Reader and Chrome, like how much security hardening has happened behind the scenes. So if you do a dump, RPC dump, this is in the kernel debugger. If you look at the ALPC ports, if you do ALPC bang LPP, you will see that there are a bunch of services which are actually exposed for both Adobe Reader and Chrome. And this is kind of the attack surface. However, Chrome has much fewer than Adobe Reader, right? And interestingly, if you see this in Adobe Reader, you have access to LSAS, which is kind of a very bad idea, I would say. Why? Because what I could do now is, in theory, I haven't tried this, I could send you a PDF document, brute force your LSAS, steal your local user passwords, and upload it to a server without exploiting anything, just a PDF. Right? So this is the problem of exposing something like LSAS to the renderer. Bad idea, right? So this hasn't happened yet. We might see it, I guess, in the future. So we have already notified the Adobe security team, and they are aware of this. But to make our work easier, we selected the common denominator, which is CSRSS. So we wanted to kind of wanted to be lazy a bit, and wanted to use the same exploit for all the various sandboxes. So we used CSRSS. So what we did is we sat down and looked at all the various vulnerabilities in CSRSS and see, okay, what is possible out here? CSRSS is exposed for pretty much every sandbox we have encountered, right? And then we came across this very interesting vulnerability, which was patched, and very few people know about it. There was no exploit available. Nobody has talked about it. It silently went quiet. So this is the vulnerability description. The vulnerability is caused by CSRSS improperly validating permissions when a low integrity process communicates a device event message to a high integrity process. As cryptic as it can be, right? Microsoft KB. So anyways, the reality is the vulnerable versions of CSRSS perform no validation or no permission check, blindly executing post messages with all parameters controlled by the peer. That is really, really bad, right? It's a design flaw. So have you heard of shatter attacks? Way back in the early 2000s, it's kind of a shatter attacks happening again in this day and world, right? Going back to the future, as they say. So now what we do is that I will use this vulnerability, and then I will break out of all the sandboxes using a user mode exploit, right? And this is how it looks like. Yes, I'll pay for the license someday. Yeah. I think I need to just reboot my machine. I ran a kernel exploit last night, so I think it's unstable. Sorry about that. This is what happens when at 1 a.m. you are playing fiddling with kernel exploits. Yeah, it screws your demo. So. Okay, so now is the fun stuff. So as you can see, I have two command prompts here. Let me take this out. So I have two command prompts here. One is with the pretty yellow bar border, right? And the one which is on the host operating system, right? So what I will do is I will run a CSRS exploit, and then what I do is I do something very cute. I've given it my own name. It's called, I'm doing remote keystroke injection. So from the sandbox, I inject into the command prompt outside the sandbox, and I can do pretty much anything I want to do. Game over, right? So let's look at this. Yes, the yellow box, the box with the yellow border is actually the sandbox, right? So I'm inside and confined in the sandbox here, and the box, the command prompt without the yellow border is outside. So I should have no access to that, right? So what I will do is that I'll break out of the sandbox and start injecting into the one outside, right? Okay. Okay, here we go. This is from the sandbox outside. Right? Which means that at this point, I can do anything I want. I can run a Trojan. I can do, this is like I've completely breached the sandbox, right? This is the fun stuff. So what I do now is I just go to FTP and I log on to a remote server, right? Steal your confidential.doc, right? Classified.doc, and then upload it by, and then I self-destruct, right? I just kill myself and game over. Complete bypass, right? So was it fun? Cool. So that was an exploit using CSRSS. Now you can see that expression on the kitty, right? Holy crap! Oh, okay. Okay. Cool. So again, so we kind of published a detailed paper. It's available on our website, labs.bromium.com, where we have a full detailed analysis on various attack vectors and how you can bypass all of these sandboxes. And again, we are focusing on it from a very different viewpoint. We are not trying to break the sandbox. We're looking at the attack surface and how can we break out of the sandbox without breaking it, by looking at vulnerabilities in the operating system itself. Because, what are the chances that Microsoft won't have a bug? Pretty low, right? So I'm banking on that pretty much. So I won't find a bug in your sandbox, but I'll find a bug in Microsoft and use that to break out of your sandbox. How do you deal with that now? Anyways, so what we found was the type A sandboxes. If you do like Metasploit testing, it blocks most exploits, which is kind of the basic, I would say, the bare minimum for sandbox testing. And then there are user mode and kernel exploit, which are exposed to the attack surface. It was very easy to break, as I just demonstrated. But the moment you find an OS vulnerability in CSRSS or Win Educated Sys, you can break out of these very easily. However, for Chrome, it was much harder. It was much more harder to break out of Chrome because of the additional hardening that has been implemented, right? And the other interesting thing we found was something called sandbox leakage. This is a new category we just created because it didn't exist, which is basically, now that the malware is inside the sandbox, what can it do, right? So we found that the malware could do key logging. So you are outside the sandbox, the malware in the sandbox, and you are going to your bank outside the sandbox. It can log your keystrokes. It has full access to what's happening, which is kind of dangerous, right? You can switch on your remote webcam. I can switch on your mic and start recording without you even being aware of this. The malware has full access to that, right? Clipboard. I have full access to your clipboard. So if you store your password in the clipboard, it's going to be fun. Screen scraping. I could screen scrape, although we found that BufferZone Pro had done something there to disallow that. So we didn't try to break that. So we just said, okay, it's medium. They thought about it. Yes, Yes. So kind of green is like they did something about it. Yellow means that I had to think about it. Red is like, what's that? It's liquor. Yeah. Yes, I would say so. Yeah. So actually, PDF Chrome has implemented their own PDF reader version, and it's kind of pretty sound from a security standpoint. Unless I haven't seen the implementation of the PDF when it comes to like kernel interfaces, because as I just demonstrated, I can break out of Chrome or any sandbox if there's a vulnerability in say CSRSS or the kernel, right? So, but yes, I agree. It's better to open a PDF than use Adobe Reader. Yeah. So network share access. You know what? From a sandbox, I had access to the network share. I can brute force your network shares accounts, and I can pretty much do anything I want from there. So I can do the fun lateral movement from the sandbox. Kind of bad to have that. Okay, so this is the exploit which you were asking about, right? So then we were asked, what if I put a sandbox in a sandbox? What if I put a browser inside a sandbox? Will that help, right? So I call it defense in depth indeed, right? So this exploit, what I do is I put Google Chrome inside Sandboxy and then bypass both, right? So this is the kind of going back there where I open Notepad and I opened a command prompt, I open Notepad, this is on the host, there's no sandbox involved, right? Now I go and open a sandbox, which is Sandboxy in this case, and then I open a command prompt, right? You see the pretty yellow border, right? Which means that I'm inside the sandbox, right? And now I cannot kill the process outside the sandbox. It's denying me access, right? So and as you can see at Process Explorer, this is basically medium integrity from an access control point of view. Now what I do is I go and open Chrome from the sandbox, so that Chrome is inside the sandbox, right? Google application, Chrome application, right? So now I have Chrome inside the sandbox. So you can see that Chrome has a pretty yellow border as well. So now you have a sandbox inside a sandbox, right? Okay. And the sandbox works. You can go to google.com, right? So it's a functional sandbox. Okay. Now, if you look at it, the important part to note here is that this is untrusted. The chrome.exe is untrusted, which means that it's a very hardened sandbox with very limited access. It can't do much, right? It's hardened by Google. And now what we do is that we run the exploit. So a little bit about how I'm using the exploit now. So what I do is that I simulate a vulnerability in the renderer. There are like hundreds of vulnerabilities in the renderer. I assume that the renderer has a vulnerability. So I inject into the renderer, and from there I load a font file. Supposing if you go visited a website which had a font file, right? I load a font file. And the moment I load the font file, I will basically I'll inject a kernel payload, and basically this is the DoQ exploit. The DoQ malware was found in the wild a couple of years back. It is kind of known to be one of the most sophisticated malware found, almost like Stuxnet kind of caliber. Because the exploit is pretty cool, actually. We actually spent some time reversing the DoQ malware to kind of recreate this exploit, right? So now I inject into the PID of the renderer, which is 1712, right? And then this is the font, T2 embed. This is the font which Google has to load to run, and then I inject exploit dll.dll, right? So as you can see a calculator pop up, which means that the exploit worked. And this has medium integrity, which means that I was able to do something there. But I think you might want to see something more interesting than a calculator. So what I do now is I do the same mechanism wherein I pivot out of both the sandboxes using WinInit, which is of PID 388 here, right? So I wake up the port for 49152 of that, and then I do a bind shell, and then I basically listen on that, right? Which means that at this point, if I do a who am I have completely pawned the machine. It's game over. Yeah. Yeah, so how it works is that I'm assuming that you go to a bad website, right? So in this case, you're inside the sandbox, right? So everything in the sandbox is untrusted, right? So this could be a URL, for instance, where I visit to a URL and then I click on a link which loaded a bad font file, and then I exploit the font file vulnerability, and then I break out of the sandbox. This is a simulation, basically. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So the font is the malicious font. So the font has a vulnerability, and the kernel is parsing the font, right? And when it's parsing the malformed font file, we'll corrupt the kernel memory and then break out of the sandbox, right? Yeah. Yeah. This is a Windows 7, but it should work on 2008 also. Yeah. I haven't tried 2012. That's a server-side platform, right? So this is more on the client side, but I think it should work on 2012. But the thing is that the vulnerability I use is a slightly old one, so we have to look for a newer vulnerability. So I'm just using a vulnerability which is kind of known instead of finding a 0-day. The idea is to prove a point on the architecture limitation, right? Oh yeah. So yeah. So I agree. Every Windows version is more secure than the previous one. That's how it works, right? That's how it works all the time. Yeah, every year is like that. So any questions so far on this? So out here, basically, to demonstrate that I have broken out. Yeah. Right. So I just reverse engineered the patch. I reverse engineered the patch from Microsoft. So there's something called patch diffing. So since the description looked interesting, so we selected which patches to look for. So what we did is, like, how it works is you take the DLL version which was patched and the one prior to that, and then we do something called binary diffing, right? So when you diff the patches, you know which function or which areas were patched by Microsoft, right? And then you try to figure out what they're trying to patch there. And then from there, we write an exploit code to basically to see, okay, what they actually patch. So there's kind of a lot of work involved behind the scenes, yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I would say that this issue was kind of went unnoticed by a lot of people. In fact, and the guy who found this exploit is a very smart guy, Alex, from sysinternal Windows. He's written the book, right? The Windows internals book. So he must have found it while doing some research. So the bug was a pretty serious bug, and I'm sure, like, similarly, a lot of these bugs, not everybody sits and reverses patches because it's a very time-consuming process. It requires a lot of resources and motivation, right? So yeah, it took us a weekend or whatever, so extra to get there, simply because we were trying to look at CSRSS reliable exploits, right? So if you look at the CSRSS exploit, why I choose that is simply because there is no memory corruption there, so I didn't have to deal with ASLR or DEP or any of those in my payloads. The code is very simple. It's like 25 lines of code because it's a design flaw implementation in CSRSS. That's why we choose that. So we actually reversed the patch. We did the binary diffing, and we found the root cause, and then then we extracted that. I wrote an exploit to kind of demonstrate this. Yeah, there was some work in the background. Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. Yeah. Yeah, good point. So yeah, it's kind of tough when you deal with such issues, right? Because see, just imagine if you look at from a large organization. This is the way I talk about this to people. So the game is why we are losing the malware problem is simply because it's a game of odds, right? So it's assume that each one of you is the smartest person on the planet, right? And you make one mistake a year, right? And there are 10,000 of you in a large company, right? Probably more in a bigger company, right? So all you have to do is just make one mistake and your organization is compromised, right? So all people have to do is send you a blast of spear phishing emails. Somebody is likely going to click on them because for some people they have to click. If your job is to scan resumes, you have to open PDFs. There is no how do you work without it, right? So I would say it's a tough problem because even if you and I were like good friends, I have no idea that your email got compromised the previous night and it's the attacker sending me an email. It's very difficult for us to really figure those out, right? That's why user education can go that far. But I think fundamentally, the products what we have to solve these problems. And I'll talk about that a little bit in my last slide on the mitigations, and what we have learned from this so far, right? So I have 5 minutes. So yeah, this is kind of the expert. This is game over, boom, right? Okay. So let's come back to the slide. So what have we learned? So yeah, so this is kind of, I'm kind of trademarking this term, defense in depth indeed. So it's kind of, anyways. So conclusion, right? So we need to really understand, we keep on adding more and more layers on our endpoint solution targeting specific attack vectors. And then what happens is that our machines become slow, right? So there is no depth of protection in pretty much most of the solutions we use today, right? And application sandbox is just one of them. So it's very important to understand the architectural limitations. This is something which cannot be fixed. You cannot do anything about it. This is a design limitation. So kernel attacks, application sandboxes are fundamentally vulnerable to kernel attacks, right? And some user mode components to which they are exposed to. Breaking out of a sandbox, as I demonstrated, is a far more efficient way. It provides you far better ROI than breaking the sandbox itself. Because the sandbox objective is to harden the code and reduce the attack surface, right? But the chances that you find a vulnerability in the OS is much better. And so you're better off using an exploit like this, right? So, and then we found that in our analysis, type A sandboxes were far easier to break out of than type B, simply because type B sandboxes like Chrome and Adobe Reader are designed just for one application, not for any arbitrary application. So the hardening you can do can be very targeted, and you can do a much better job in making sure the attack surface is limited, right? But a type A sandbox like Sandboxy is like a very generic platform. It is not robust enough. And you know what? Some people actually do malware analysis inside sandboxes like Sandboxy. Don't do that. That's bad. Things will happen. So really avoid that. So one of the solutions is to provide a depth of protection. You can use a VM-based solution where you have like a virtualized stack of your whole operating system. So even if there's a kernel vulnerability inside the VM sandbox, you can't break out of it. You have to break out of the hypervisor, which is far more difficult than, say, breaking out of a sandbox itself, right? And then like CSRSS, all these vulnerabilities are no longer a problem there. So that's an alternative. Yeah. Yes, I mentioned that. Yeah. That's pretty cool. And in fact, when I went to Blue Hat earlier this year, we told Microsoft that, can we have something like this, please, on Windows? Yeah.
Why was the Chrome sandbox more hardened than the Chromium one? Is there an architectural difference?
Yes. The Google guys have done a lot more work on hardening Chrome. Extra work has been implemented, done. I kind of mentioned it in some of my earlier slides. They have done a lot of extra work. I've kind of mentioned that in the paper, which I just mentioned about. We have a detailed paper on that.
Put that in the Chromium version.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know how it works because Adobe Reader is using Chromium, and you know what? They haven't done the amount of hardening as what Chrome has done. So yeah, I haven't. I don't know why. Even the published version of open source Chrome is I would say is not up to date with the security updates on Chrome. Chrome is like the cutting edge, and Chromium is kind of, I would say, a little bit behind. Simply because I guess it's open source, but now Chrome is like Google's flagship browser or whatever, and they're competing with Microsoft, right? So I guess that's the reason. But it is not up to date, I can tell you for sure, at least when I checked last. So acknowledgements, my colleague Rafael Wojcik, who worked with me on this paper. This paper is available to download from labs.bromium.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to ping me on Twitter. This is my Twitter ID, and on email or wherever on the internet, right? So I think I think I'm just on time. I just did it, yes. Any other questions? Yeah. Right, so Adobe Reader and Chrome, like you cannot have Adobe Reader inside Chrome, because they have a plugin for it, yeah, whatever is there. But the point is that I haven't played with the plugin, but the problem is that the moment there's a kernel interaction, I can still break. The point is that even if you layer sandboxes as I demonstrated, sandbox in a sandbox, I'm accessing the kernel directly. So I'm bypassing the architecture. You cannot do anything about it. I can still bypass those as well. Doesn't matter. In a VM, yeah. In a VM, yeah. That's probably the only way out, I would say. Yeah. Yeah, we're done. Thank you. Thank you.